Hello. Today we're here to talk about the Electoral College, which is the very confusing way that the United States of America elects its president. It has nothing to do with going to college, going to university. It has nothing to do with that. It's an old-fashioned term, but we'll talk about that in a few moments. So, what is the Electoral College? In Article 2 of the United States Constitution, they structure and outline the ways in which we elect presidents here in the United States. And the most important thing to start with is people don't elect presidents in the United States. We do not have a popular vote system nationally to elect presidents. States are the ones that elect presidents. Now, within states, there are in fact popular votes. The way they do it is a little bit different in a couple of states, but it works basically the same. Whichever candidate gets the most votes across the entire state then wins that state. But we'll see that there are some problems with that basic idea as well. So the states get a certain number of what are called electoral votes, and that's based upon the population of the state. So if you have a large population, then you're going to have more electoral votes. And there are only a total of 538 electoral votes, and we'll talk about why it's that weird number. And so a candidate has to win 270 electoral votes to win the presidency. So that is half of 538 plus one, right? And that's how you get to 270. So a candidate must win 270 electoral votes to win the presidency. I'm not going to actually have you read Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution, so you're welcome. But I'll just summarize and say that presidents are elected on a ticket with a vice presidential candidate. So that person is also chosen by the American people, which means that the president cannot fire that person. Donald Trump cannot fire Mike Pence. He can choose to not have him on the presidential ticket if he wanted to, but he can't actually fire him because Pence was elected by the American people in the same way that Trump was. So we have our presidential election in November. Since the 1850s, it's been officially the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November because they wanted to be confusing. But that date is set by Congress. It is not set by the president. The president has no authority to change the date of a presidential election. The date is set by Congress. So we have the election on November 3rd, and then in December, the electors from each state that represent the winning candidate in that state go to Washington, D.C. to participate in this meeting called the Electoral College. And at that meeting, they count up all the votes, and whoever receives a majority is elected president. Now, when we're not counting 200 million votes, we're just counting the 538 electoral votes. And whoever gets the majority will be elected president. Okay, so how many electoral votes does your state get? Well, that's dependent upon the number of senators and representatives that the state has in the United States Congress. And of course, the number of representatives that a state has is based upon the state's population. And so that's how the electoral college system is kind of related to the state's population, but it's not exact at all. So every state, as we know, gets two senators and at least one representative based upon their population. So if you're a small state, you only have one representative in the House, whereas if you're a very large state, you could have as many as 53, which is how many California has right now. So that means that every state is going to have at least three electoral votes. You can't have any less than three electoral votes as a state. Washington, D.C. is the only part of the United States of America that isn't a state, but also gets to vote for president. So D.C. gets three electoral votes, even though it's not a state, and even though it doesn't have any representation in Congress. U.S. territories do not get to vote for president. So even though Puerto Rico, for example, is a part of the United States of America, they do not get to vote for president because they're not a state. Most states just have a straight up popular vote, right? So, for example, New Mexico, if you get 50% plus one of the vote for president in New Mexico, you win all 5 electoral votes. There are a couple of states, Nebraska and Maine, that do it a little bit differently, but we'll see that in a couple of slides. The number of electoral votes that a state can have actually can change every 10 years after the census, right? The census tells us how many people live in every state, and that helps us determine how many members of the House of Representatives that state gets, and that then in turn changes the number of electoral votes. So, every 10 years, we tend to see some states losing the number of electoral votes that they have and other states gaining. And the pattern right now is the South and the Southwest are gaining seats and the Northeast is losing seats. So this is the current Electoral College map. This is based upon the 2010 census. So, we're having a census in 2020, which means that in our next presidential election in 2024, I mean, next after the 2020 election, these numbers will probably change, and it will be interesting to see through the census how exactly they change. So you can see there's a pretty wide range there. California is in the lead with 55 electoral votes, seconded by Texas with 38 electoral votes, and then at the other end of the spectrum, you can see that there are a lot of states that only have 3. And what that tells you immediately is this is a state with a small population. Sometimes we get geographic size, area, confused with population. So Alaska is an enormous state with a tiny population. Same with Montana. It's a very big state, very small population, but you can then, if you look in the Northeast, you can see, for example, Massachusetts is a pretty small state, but it has 11 electoral votes, the same as Arizona, right? So it doesn't have anything to do with the physical area, it has to do with the population. And this will change in a couple of years because of the census. Now, small states do end up having an advantage in the Electoral College. We have this idea in our society that, one person, one vote. We don't have that system. We have never had that system because of the Electoral College. So, just as an example, one of our smallest states is Wyoming. Wyoming has 3 electoral votes. They have a total of about 600,000 people in the state of Wyoming, and so that means that for every electoral vote in Wyoming, it represents about 200,000 people. But in California, one electoral vote is equivalent to 700,000 people. So even though Wyoming only has 3 electoral votes and California has 55, because there are 35 million people who live in California and only about 600,000 people who live in Wyoming, each person in Wyoming has an unfair representation in the Electoral College compared to people who live in bigger states, right? If you have 200,000 people saying we represent one vote and 700,000 people in California saying we represent one vote, that's fundamentally unfair. And, this shouldn't surprise us given that it's the United States of America, but the system was constructed to give advantage to the wealthier slave states, right? The wealthiest states in the country when the country was formed were the southern states because of the amount of money they made off of slavery. It was the northern states were much less wealthy during that period, and so those southern states not only were the wealthiest, but they also tended outside of Virginia to have a very small population, and so they wanted to make sure that their political power was going to be preserved. There are a lot of issues with the Electoral College. It is fundamentally undemocratic, as we saw in the previous slide. If we were truly going to be a democracy, then every person's vote would weigh the same. And in a presidential election, that just isn't true. Furthermore, it also doesn't even reflect the actual voter distribution in the states. So in recent years, New Mexico has been a solidly Democratic state when voting in presidential elections. I don't think they've I don't think New Mexico has gone for a Republican since 2004, maybe. But we know that as soon as you get outside of Albuquerque or Santa Fe or Las Cruces or any of the Native American reservations, that there are, in fact, a lot of very conservative people in New Mexico, but their votes don't actually end up kind of seeming to count, so to speak, when we look at New Mexico as a whole. And we see similar things in larger states back east, like Illinois and New York, that have huge cities and then a much larger area outside of that city that is very conservative. But there are just so many people that live in Chicago and live in New York City that it outweighs those rural areas. Another huge problem with the Electoral College is that in the last 5 presidential elections, 2 of them were won by the candidate that did not win the popular vote. I'll say that again. The winner of the electoral vote did not also win the popular vote twice. So, for example, in 2016, which is one of those years, Donald Trump got 63 million votes across the United States of America, and Hillary Clinton got 66 million votes across the United States of America. So Hillary beat Donald Trump by 3 million voters, approximately. On the other hand, with the Electoral College, Donald Trump won 304 electoral votes and Hillary Clinton won 227. Now, that might seem very confusing to you, that how is it that the person who won 3 million more votes ended up with so many fewer electoral votes? And that's because of this system that gives an unfair advantage to small states. There are so many people in California, in New York City, in Chicago, that voted for Hillary Clinton, that their votes end up not counting as much, because we know that those small states, the number of people per electoral vote is much, much smaller. The 2016 election was ultimately decided by only about 70,000 voters across these 3 states in the Midwest: Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And so if you just look at the amount by which Donald Trump won in those 3 states, had it just flipped a total of 70,000 seats in Clinton's favor, then she would have won both the popular vote, which she did win, and the Electoral College vote, which she did not. Now, there's an historical irony about the Electoral College. One of the people that was the most enthusiastically in support of the Electoral College was a guy that you might have heard of named Alexander Hamilton. And he wrote in a document called the Federalist Papers, and specifically Federalist number 68, that one of the reasons why we should really, really like to have the Electoral College is that it would prevent individuals who are unfit for a variety of reasons to be in the position of the chief executive of the country. The Electoral College was fundamentally a structure to preserve the power of the elite, and what they felt was that, okay, if the rabble, if just like the regular people, they're voting for electors, not for a president, then those electors, who would be, elite people who would, presumably know better than the common man, and they would then decide who should be the best person for that state to choose to be the president. Obviously, we have traveled very far from that over the last 230 years. This is an Electoral College map of the 2016 presidential election. So you can see the states that Clinton won are in blue, and the states that Trump won are in red. And you can see some pretty basic geographical divisions here when you look at this. The West Coast is very solidly Democratic, and the Northeast is very solidly Democratic. The Deep South, right? The Deep South is the Carolinas, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas. The Deep South is very solidly Republican and has been for quite a long time. And then we see these other areas that had been places where Democrats usually won presidential elections going back, a few decades, that Trump won, and that's specifically Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, as we talked about on the previous slide. If those three states had gone for Hillary Clinton, she would have won. Now, on a previous slide, I mentioned that Maine and Nebraska do their electoral college distribution a little bit differently. What they do is they say, all right, we're going to break out those electoral votes by geographic region. So Maine has a coastal area that's pretty Democratic, and then an interior that is pretty Republican. And that's actually the way a lot of states are like, that you have one part of the state, or maybe the major city in the state, that's very Democratic, and then a larger area that is rural and has a much lower population density that's pretty conservative, right? And so you can see in 2016 that Maine actually gave one of its electoral votes to Donald Trump because Trump won that particular part of the state of Maine. So I now want to show you the electoral map from 8 years earlier when Barack Obama became the president. So this is the 2008 electoral map, and for starters, we can see that a lot of those Midwestern states, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Iowa, they all went for Barack Obama. Whereas many of them ended up going for Donald Trump in 2016, which right there in and of itself is a hard thing to get your mind around, but we'll talk about that. As we saw with Maine in 2016, giving one of their electoral votes to Donald Trump, we can see on this map in 2008 in Nebraska, it was the opposite. Nebraska, pretty much a conservative state, but they have one decent sized city in Nebraska, and cities tend to vote Democratic in the last 20 or 30 years. And so that one part of Nebraska voted for Barack Obama, and because they have that other system, that then Obama picked up one electoral vote in Nebraska. There are a few other areas that Barack Obama won in 2008 that then went over to Donald Trump 8 years later, and that would specifically be the southern states of North Carolina and Florida, and those are very much what we call swing states. This is that 2016 electoral map again, but I just wanted you to be able to see it after having seen the 2008 map, so you can see how the Midwest was a terrible, terrible region for Hillary Clinton in 2016. This is a different way of looking at the presidential election results from 2016. And what this does is it actually breaks it out by what's called electoral precinct. So when you go and vote in November, you're going to, unless you do it by mail and you still have to fill this information in, you're going to go to a place, probably a school or a church basement or something like that. And you're going to be directed to a particular precinct that may only represent a couple thousand actual voters. And so this map shows the breakout by precinct rather than by state. And as soon as you see this, you can pretty much see every place where there's either a major city or a Native American reservation or an area with a large number of non-white voters. And so we're going to look at just a couple of those. So, there's a big old blob kind of in the southwestern region of the United States, and that is basically the Navajo country stretching all the way into Santa Fe and Albuquerque. But I want to draw your attention to first what is circled in green. That is more or less New York State. And as you can see, most of the color that's inside that green circle is red, because that represents the part of New York that they refer to as upstate New York, which is a more rural area. But the population of New York City and its immediate area is so large relative to the rest of the state, and also so overwhelmingly Democratic in the way that it votes, that even though most of the actual area of the state of New York votes Republican, that part doesn't matter. It's the people. But at least this gives you a sense of where are the rural areas and where are the urban areas and the areas where large numbers of non-white people live. Just to look briefly at the yellow circle is more or less the state of Illinois. And you can see there that other than like a couple of little bluish dots, the blue blob at the very top part of that oval, that's Chicago. So Illinois has a major city called Chicago that votes overwhelmingly Democratic, and almost the entire rest of the state votes Republican. And then the thing that kind of looks like Pac-Man represents the area across the South where large numbers of African American people live. And so even though in 2016 Hillary Clinton didn't win any of the states of the Deep South, the way that Barack Obama did win Florida and North Carolina in 2008, you can still see that there are large numbers of African Americans that live in the South that effectively don't get represented in the presidential election. This is yet another way to look at an electoral map, but what this one does is it makes each electoral vote the same size. When we look at our geographic maps, we say, wow, Alaska's huge and New Jersey's tiny, right? But you can see on this map in the upper left-hand corner, Alaska's only 3 electoral votes, but New Jersey is 14 electoral votes because population is what actually matters with the electoral vote. And so even though the previous slide makes it look like there are tiny little islands of blue in an enormous sea of red, once you see the electoral votes of equal size, you can say, oh, look at that. The District of Columbia, which is just a city, has as many electoral votes as Alaska, which is an absolutely enormous space. Now, you might be saying to yourself as you look at this map, wait a minute, who's Powell and who's Kasich and who's Paul? And this is the issue of, do electors have to actually vote for the candidate that they're told to vote for, right? So we have the election in November. That's how we decide who wins each state. And then the electors go to the Electoral College to conduct their vote. But sometimes when they get there, they say, hey, I know I was supposed to vote for Hillary Clinton, or I know I was supposed to vote for Donald Trump, but I'm not going to do that. And there was sort of a legal gray area as to whether or not that's even legal to do. But as you can see in 2016, quite a few electors were what they're called faithless electors. And the Supreme Court in 2020 said, actually, that's not cool anymore. You can't do that. So, you have 3 electors in the state of Washington who should have been voting for Clinton in the Electoral College, and they voted for someone called Powell, and I don't even know who Powell is. And you can see one of the electors from Hawaii, who was supposed to vote for Hillary Clinton, in fact, voted for Bernie Sanders. And so that's no longer legal. So you won't see that in the 2020 election. It's all going to either be Joe Biden or Donald Trump. Now, a lot of people think that the Electoral College is fundamentally unfair and undemocratic, and I would be one of those people. But the Electoral College isn't going anywhere. The only way to get rid of the Electoral College is to amend the Constitution, and that's a really, really hard thing to do. You would basically have to get some of those smaller states to actually just choose to surrender the political power that they have and to subordinate themselves to the cities and the larger states. And if you look at the chart, you can see that 81% of Democrats in 2017 said, yeah, we should get rid of the Electoral College and just have a national popular vote, the way every other democracy on earth does. But only 19% of Republicans thought that. Now, you could say maybe that has something to do with the election, because if you look at 2012, the numbers are much, much closer, right? So obviously the election of Donald Trump in 2016 did something to the way that Democrats and Republicans feel about the electoral vote. But so long as you have one political party that is completely disinterested in changing the system is never going to change. To summarize, we here in the United States do not vote directly for the president. States vote for the president. The Electoral College was created to maintain the power of the elites, and not just the southern slave owners, the elites of the North as well, because the whole point there was to try to keep the so-called rabble from being able to mess up an election by, choosing a demagogue who is, tied to a foreign country or something like that. And that is literally in Hamilton's writing in Federalist 68. That is not me editorializing. The system gives more electoral power to smaller states. It, as a result, is fundamentally undemocratic and unrepresentative because people who are in the minority in a state, whether we're talking about African Americans in an overwhelmingly Republican southern state or Republicans living in a very democratic state like California or New Mexico, they also really don't get the representation that they deserve. And lastly, the Electoral College will probably never go away. Thank you for watching this presentation. I hope it was informational for you, and feel free to check out any of the other videos on the channel.